This is Senator Sullivan and Professor Steinbuch together again. You may notice something different. This is our third video. We switched seats to change it up a little bit. We want to talk a little bit about affirmative action. I ran a bill in past session about affirmative action, Senate Bill 71, that gained a lot of attention and a lot of good discussion. Unfortunately, it didn't pass. It ran kind of late in the session, but it had to do with state-sponsored discrimination. Not all discrimination, just state-sponsored discrimination. Can you talk a little bit about discrimination, state-sponsored and other discrimination?
Indeed. So, of course, we know that there will always be some element of bad people out there, and they will discriminate. And we should work to minimize that, but we'll never eliminate it. But that's different, as you well know, than government endorsing discrimination.
Right.
And of course, affirmative action is government endorsed discrimination.
Yeah, and that was one of the difficult parts to get across to people, because they came across in media and other publications saying Senate Bill 71 is intended to end discrimination. That's not it at all. It just ended the state-sponsored discrimination. And of course, the Supreme Court came out in a narrow decision on higher ed discrimination. Can you talk? Matter of fact, you were mentioned by the Supreme Court justice in that decision.
That's right. So there was a case in which two universities were sued regarding their admissions programs. They were using race as a factor in admissions, and the court said you can't do that. That's against the law. It's unconstitutional. And now, of course, the logic of that should extend quite broadly, but we've seen it since day one that those in power tend to interpret those opinions as narrowly as possible to continue their programs of discrimination.
Yeah, one of the things we're doing right now in some of our legislative committees is looking at DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that essentially is a form of discrimination when you pick certain people based on certain characteristics and put them in positions or eliminate them from positions in government, which is just exactly what the Supreme Court said. You can't use those characteristics to make decisions.
Well, DEI is the engine on the train that is discrimination and affirmative action. It's just one piece, and it's a primary piece. And much like what has transpired with affirmative action, that case that we just raised, the schools were dodging and were not forthcoming. We had previous video on transparency. They were completely untransparent about what they were doing. And now the same thing we see with these DEI programs. DEI programs were embedded affirmative action programs, and now they make all sorts of claims and they try to not to be nailed down as to what they're doing. But what they're doing is a form of affirmative action. And when you conducted a hearing before the Senate, you even asked one school, hey, do you admit different groups with different scores on entrance exams? And they were reluctant, Dan, but they finally admitted, well, yes, we do. And then they backpedaled by saying, but we assure you that we only let in the most qualified candidates. Well, which is it, Dan? Which is it?
As a matter of fact, we have the documentation. As a state senator, I don't have to rely on FOIA as much as a private citizen does. But we've come forward. We have more information. We'll be having those hearings shortly. Another thing we found out that when we appoint people to state commissions, I think there are like 7 or 8 different commissions, that we often appoint people to those committees based upon DEI principles, based upon whether you're based upon your gender, based upon your race, and we say, well, there's implicit bias, and therefore we want people with implicit bias to be on those committees. And as you often say, wait, what?
Exactly.
And how do you put people on a commission who you anticipate having implicit bias, but while on one hand we don't like implicit bias, but on the other hand we're going to put those people on a commission
for their implicit
bias. Talk about that.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. But this is the difficulty when you try to walk that tightrope that is discrimination, called DEI, called affirmative action. Chief Justice Roberts said it best when he said, effectively, the way you end discrimination is stop discriminating. But that's not what we've seen historically. We've seen all forms of discrimination. Oh, we need to have a mandatory number of minorities here and a mandatory number of such and such here. And you can't do that. You'll never win that battle of discrimination. And of course, we hear all this discussion about, well, people have implicit bias, so we need to work against that. But you don't work against it by putting other people with implicit bias to offset the alleged implicit bias. You work against it by working to remove all forms of biases. That's the only way to achieve both equality and equity.
As a matter of fact, I met with a number of different groups in running that bill. Black Caucus, the NAACP, women's groups, all kinds of groups I met with privately to discuss it. And all of them pretty much said, look, we don't like implicit bias that this group of people has, but we want you to put someone from our group in there so that our implicit bias will negate what yours is. And of course, the goal is, says, all people are created equal. That's our goal. And as Chief Justice Roberts said, we'll never end discrimination by perpetuating discrimination. And folks, that's it's a hard hill to climb. But at some point, our nation is going to have to work that way. There are 10 states, I believe, maybe 11, that have legislation similar to what we proposed. And I think it's a good thing to do. Now, how do we get there? We're going to have to get a lot of folks together that help navigate that very difficult path.
That's right. Yeah, no, I think your point about having almost a dozen states already having passed this, it's due time to happen in Arkansas. We are a very conservative state with a very conservative governor and a very conservative legislature. So it's time for us to get it done.
Yeah, and when we ran this bill, we pretty much knew what the Supreme Court was going to say. We had a lot of hints that they were going to come down against affirmative action or rule against it. How broad that decision was is still yet to be determined, because they're specifically dealt with higher ed, but it also, our bill dealt with procurement and hiring. So who are we buying our products from, and who are we hiring, not just in higher ed. So there's a group of people now, a large number, that say, yeah, we can't have the bias in higher ed, but I don't know about procurement, and I don't know about purchasing. So those discussions need to happen. We have the bill in an interim study right now. It'll probably be after the first of the year before we bring that up and have a hearing on it. But I hope we can move forward and help us reach that higher principle. And of course, the Attorney General made the statement that Senate Bill 71 brought us closer to the original intent in the Constitution. Any comments to close us down?
Yeah, just you bring up such an important point, which is a lot of folks say, well, we have this Supreme Court decision. You want to wait another 50 years to figure out all the details of that? Or you want to pass Dan Sullivan's bill that will take care of all of that in the state immediately? Of course, the latter is the better way to go.
Yeah, and of course, again, it only applies to state government.
That's right. And
only for procurement and education and hiring. Those are the areas that it implies or works toward. So again, thank you very much. Robert and I'll probably get together on other issues and do some more discussion. If you've got an idea that you'd like to hear us discuss, or hear me discuss with someone else, or hear Robert with someone else, just shoot us a message. We'll be glad to put that together. Have a good day.
Thank you.